Throwaway because my family is nosy and I don't want this tied to my business. I'm 32, self-made, financially stable, living in a quiet apartment I picked for its light and the way the windows don't look onto anyone else's life. I run a small software firm that does unglamorous things, routing tables, inventory sync, getting 1,000 tiny numbers to agree. My day is mostly emails, client calls, and automating the hassles people pretend are too boring to fix. I like boring. Boring pays, boring sleeps. I make more than enough, and nobody gets to tell me when the heat goes on or when I can open the fridge. If that last sentence sounds odd, it won't by the end. I grew up with a ledger. Not mine. Theirs. My parents didn't call it the ledger, but it had a plastic cover and a sticker that said home budget in my mother's tidy block letters. It lived on top of the fridge like a holy book. If the Bible tells you how to live, the ledger told me how much my living cost. Milk, $3.49. Field trip, $12. Sneakers, $46. 12. Toothpaste, $2. 19. You think money grows on trees? My father would say, flipping the pages and tapping the red ink like he was scoring a game only he understood. We provide you a roof, food, schooling. You'll pay us back someday. That's how family works. We're not a charity. He loved that line. We're not a charity. He said it as a joke the first time, I think. Then he said it with a smile. Then without the smile. Eventually, it stopped being a line and became a rule. My mother had a softer delivery, but the same message. We put you first, she'd say, after reminding me to turn off the lights when I left a room. Your father works so hard. I do all this laundry. Do you ever think about how you'll repay us when you're grown? She'd ask it like a hypothetical, like bedtime talk. Her hand would stroke my hair and then pause, waiting for the answer. The correct answer was always yes. Sometimes she'd add, I don't want to keep track, but you know it adds up. She was keeping track. Money was a thermostat in our house. It set the temperature of every conversation. We were not poor, not in the sense that there wasn't food. There was always food, just not mine. There was food with conditions. Not the good yogurt, my mother would say, sliding my hand away from the brand she liked. That's for lunches. You have the other one. Labels appeared on leftovers like little do not touch signs. I learned to scan for my name and the absence of theirs. Birthdays were balanced out. We spent $85, $50 on your cake and party, my father would say as I picked at the frosting. You see this? That's generosity. The least you can do is show some gratitude. Gratitude meant saying thank you and accepting a lecture about compound interest on the drive home. If I showed too much joy, he'd gesture at the ledger, as if my happiness was a red line item that needed trimming. I remember the first time I saw the ledger open to a page with my name at the top. It was winter, the kind where the inside of the windows sweat. I must have been 8. My father was in a chair, boots off, socks smelling like the garage. The TV was low, some news anchor outlining national debt like it mattered to me. Dad flipped through receipts and wrote the words child expenses, me, in red, underlining twice. The underline squirmed, like he'd been too eager and his hand couldn't keep up. He saw me watching and smiled. You're a good investment, he said. One day you'll pay dividends. I laughed because he laughed, and I thought dividends meant something like trophies. The older I got, the more precise the numbers became. It's $39. $95 for those jeans because you keep growing, he'd say in the store, eyes flicking to the price tag like it was an accusation. Remember that when you talk back. If I asked for a sleepover, the ledger came up. Who's paying for the pizza? If I wanted to join a club, what about the fees? What about gas to drive you? The question was never whether something was good for me. It was whether my balance could tolerate it. Sometimes love felt like a coupon clipped and held up to the light. My mother made lists on the fridge. Electric, $108. 13. Groceries, $147. 22. Water, $34. 60. Next to electric, she'd draw a little light bulb with a frown. If you leave a light on, that's your future bill going up, she'd say, tapping the paper with a magnet shaped like a pineapple. We're trying to teach you responsibility. You need to understand what you owe. They liked the word owe. It was cleaner than love. Love is messy and mutual. Owe is one-directional, like gravity. Don't forget who pays the bills, my father would say when I hesitated to give him the remote. Don't forget whose roof you're under, when I asked if I could close my door. Don't forget who bought those shoes, when I tripped over them in the hallway, and he told me to pick them up faster. The refrains were like the creak on the third stair, predictable, unavoidable. I'd hear them in my head before they were out of his mouth, and still they landed like a slap. The ledger wasn't just paper. It was a way of being watched. When my report card came home, the A's got compared to the cost of the classroom supplies drive. "Looks like we got our money's worth," Dad would say, and my mother would smile like that was praise. If I brought home a B, Dad would pinch the bridge of his nose and ask whether I understood sunk costs. "We can't get back the time we spent helping you," he'd say. "Don't waste our investment." Helping meant quizzing me at the table while he complained about kids these days and entitlement. Words he'd roll in his mouth like they were sour candies he kept chewing just to prove he could swallow them. When other kids got lectured, they got grounded. When I got lectured, I got invoices disguised as aphorisms. People who don't repay their debts don't deserve credit. A man who eats without paying is a thief. You'll thank us when you're older. I began to understand that in our house, gratitude was a currency and affection a discount that could be revoked. There were good days, because that's how it works, right? A new book from the library. My mother humming while she chopped onions. My father once telling me he was proud after I fixed the VCR by pressing the right combination of buttons. "You might be useful yet," he said, half laughing, and for a second I felt warm, like I'd paid enough for a small seat near a fire. Then he added, "Remember, college isn't free," and the fire went out. It's funny what sticks. The smell of lemon cleaner. The squeak of my father's red pen. The way my mother's hand would hover before it landed on my shoulder, as if weighing the cost of touch. I internalized the math. I started keeping my own ledger in my head, not of money, but of breath. If I laughed too loud, did that cost me later? If I asked for help, was I creating a debt I'd never pay? I learned to minimize myself until even the floorboards forgot I was there. I don't write this to ask for pity. I write it because the story doesn't make sense without the texture of those days. The way I flinched at praise. The way I preemptively said, "I know, I owe you," whenever someone did something nice, and how that made people look at me funny in middle school. The way I started counting everything, calories, steps, minutes, because numbers made the chaos smaller. If you can tally a thing, you can contain it. If you can balance a sheet, maybe you can balance a heart. There's a memory that keeps returning whenever I try to explain why I left early. I was 14. The hot water went cold halfway through my shower because my mother had set a kitchen timer for showers and my time was up. I stepped out, shivering, towel thin and rough against the chill. "You took too long," she called through the door. "Do you think hot water is free?" And I said, "No, because that's what you say," and I dried off fast, and I watched steam fade on the mirror until I could see my face. I looked like a boy trying to choose between two columns on a balance sheet, assets and liabilities. I didn't know which side I belonged to. I only knew I didn't want to be a line item in someone else's book forever. If you're reading this and thinking, "That's just strict parenting," okay. Maybe where you're from, parents say my house, my rules, and it's mostly a laugh. I grew up under rules that had receipts. It's different when love is tipped toward you like a scale that only balances if you stand perfectly still. I'm not 14 anymore. I'm 32, and I don't clip coupons out of fear. I track expenses because it's my job and because I like clean spreadsheets. But the first sheet I ever wanted to clean was that ledger on the fridge. I used to imagine tearing out the pages and feeding them to the sink disposal, watching red ink ribbon into the drain. I used to imagine writing a number and circling it, a number big enough to make the house quiet. Back then, I didn't know how to get to that number. I only knew that someday, if I could, I'd make the math work in my favor. Not to win, to be even. To put the book down and walk away. That's the context. That's who I am now and where I came from. If this sounds cold, it's because cold was the temperature set by our thermostat and our ledger, and the way, was the daily weather. The rest of the story is about how I turned the heat on for myself and what it cost to do it. By middle school, I'd started translating every sentence at home into money. "How was your day?" Mint, "Did we get a return on those school supplies?" "Can you help with the groceries?" Mint, "We're going to point at the receipt later." The ledger would be open on the table when I got home from the bus. My dad would slide a receipt into a plastic sleeve the way other people slide photos into albums. He'd glance up like a banker reviewing a loan request and ask, "Do you deserve the good bread today or the bargain loaf?" He'd laugh, but it wasn't a joke. If I reached for the multi-grain with nuts, he'd tap the ledger. I learned to like dry. When I was 12, I needed a cavity filled. The dentist told my mom it would be a small copay. On the drive home, my mom put one hand on the steering wheel and one on the dashboard, like she was bracing for a crash. "Do you know how much sugar costs us?" she said. "You don't just rot your teeth, you rot our bank account." I swallowed and said, "I'm sorry," because sorry is cheaper than arguing. That night, my dad added dental $65.00 in red and told me to smile for the family accountant. "Show us the $65 smile," he said. I smiled and felt something chip inside that wasn't enamel. High school was when they upgraded from warnings to penalties. Freshman year, I got my first job bagging groceries at the discount store. You had to buy your own vest if you wanted a second one for laundry days. My first paycheck arrived like a golden ticket, except my father was at the kitchen table waiting with a manila folder and a checkbook. "Congratulations," he said. "Time to learn about overhead." He made me write rent on a blank line of a spiral notebook. He set the number without looking at my take-home pay. 50%, he said. "It'll teach you the value of money." My mom handed me a piggy bank I'd used as a kid. "Put the rest in here so you don't waste it," she said, like she was doing me a kindness. Later, I found the piggy bank had no stopper. The coins fell straight out when you tipped it. When other kids argued about curfew, I negotiated interest rates. My dad invented them. If I missed a chore, the debt accrued. Mow the lawn, minus $10 off an invisible balance. Leave a plate in the sink, plus $5. Borrow the car for a school project, gas money, flat fee, plus usage depreciation, a phrase he relished. "It's simple economics," he'd say, and he'd sketch a graph of a line going down to show how my value decreased every time I behaved like a teenager. He never sketched the line going up when I got into honors classes or when my manager wrote "reliable" on my evaluation. Good news was a receipt that got misfiled. There were moments I tried to cash in affection just to see if it existed. Once, sophomore year, I brought home a flyer for the debate team. The membership fee was $40. "They have scholarships," the coach had said, but the flyer suggested asking your parents first. I waited until dinner, when the plates were down and the chicken was portioned out like rations. I explained that I'd already helped the team captain carry boxes, that the coach said I had a knack for argument. My dad cut his chicken into perfect cubes and said, "You already argue for free." My mom said, "Do they pay you?" I said no. My dad said, "Then it's a hobby and hobbies are luxury items. Down the road, when you pay us back, you can join all the clubs you want." I told the coach the next day I couldn't afford it. She looked at me like I'd said I couldn't afford air. I learned to oxygenate myself quietly. The phrase "roof over your head" became a refrain. It showed up everywhere, like an ad campaign targeted directly at my sense of safety. As long as you're under my roof, you'll follow my rules. When you have your own roof, you can do things your way. Remember, we put a roof over your head. You'll pay it back. Roof became a bill and home became a contract. When I lay in bed at night and watched the shadows from the streetlight turn my ceiling into a moving grid, I'd think, one day, that roof won't be a ceiling. One day, it'll be something I stand under because I chose it. To their friends, my parents were saints. "We keep 'em in line," my dad would say at barbecues, and everyone would nod like that was parental competence, not a threat. "Kids need structure," my mom would add, and she'd list the ways. Chore charts, screen time limits, our famous budget. She'd call it our budget, as if I was a co-signer and not the collateral. If I tried to share a story about the time I fixed the dryer belt with a paperclip or the time I helped the neighbor move a sofa and he gave me $20, my dad would jump in. "He's learning the value of money," he'd announce, like he'd invented it. I'd fold the story back up and put it away. Junior year, I asked for a copy of my birth certificate because school needed it for something. My father fetched a lockbox and made a show of jangling the key. "This is where we keep important documents," he said. He opened it slowly. Inside were the usual papers, plus a handwritten sheet titled Major Investments. Under it, hospital delivery, $3,200. Crib, $149.99. Car seat, $75.00. He'd gone back and reconstructed my infancy like a startup seed round. "You can borrow the original," he said, "but bring it back. It's an asset." I wondered if I counted as an asset that appreciated or depreciated. I already knew his answer. I found workarounds. I stopped asking. I used the library for warmth and internet. I said no to outings so I wouldn't have to log them. I learned to cook with whatever was cheapest in the bulk bin and to make food for myself that didn't look like leftovers someone could claim. I timed my showers to the click of the kitchen timer and turned the water off while I soaped, not because they told me to, but because I didn't want to hear about kilowatts again. My orchestration of my small life was meticulous. It looked like obedience. Inside, it was resistance. There were cracks in their certainty. Once, when I was 16, my dad's car wouldn't start. He opened the hood and poked at nothing. I fetched a multimeter from the school's auto shop, with permission. I diagnosed a dead battery, then a dirty terminal. I cleaned it, and the engine turned over. My dad stood there, surprised, and for a second, he looked at me like a person and not a ledger entry. "Good job," he said, and I almost said, "Do I get a credit?" Because my brain had become a calculator that ran on sarcasm. I swallowed it. He went inside and later, at dinner, told my mom he'd had to fix the car. I realized even my competence could be amortized into his narrative. I stopped offering to fix things I didn't have to live with. Senior year brought the guidance counselor asking what I wanted to do. I said leave. She smiled like that was a metaphor. "College?" she asked. I nodded and said I'd figure it out. We did FAFSA at school because I didn't want to do it at home and have it become another proof of how much I owed. I applied to state schools with decent programs and one near enough I could commute. When the acceptance came, my mother put it on the fridge next to a magnetic notepad that said groceries and the weekly totals. "We're proud," she said, then quickly, "but we can't subsidize a pipe dream." My father said, "You can stay here and go to community college. We'll give you a discount on rent if you do more chores." The discount was still more than my whole paycheck. The last winter before I left, we had a storm that took out the power. The house went cold fast. We huddled in coats and made soup on the camp stove. In the candlelight, without the hum of the fridge or the accusing stare of the ledger, my mom told a story about her own childhood, how her father kept envelopes of cash for each bill and made a show of counting them. "It's how I learned," she said, eyes far away. Money was respect. I thought money was permission. I wondered who she'd learned to be afraid of and how that fear had found me. My dad, even in the dim, found a way to say, "This is why you save." Like the storm was a teachable moment he'd conjured to make a point. People ask sometimes why I didn't blow up, why there isn't a dramatic scene where I tell them to shove their ledger. The truth is, I was conserving energy. Rage is expensive. Silence cost me less. I kept my head down. I stacked shifts. I did my research in the corners of the library where the fluorescent lights buzzed like they were thinking. I Googled emancipation and then closed the tab because I could hear my father's voice in my head saying, "You can't afford that." I learned about scholarships, about Pell Grants, about how your expected family contribution could be zero on paper and still somehow be $1,000 in real life. On my 18th birthday, they gave me a card. My mother wrote, "We're so excited to see the man you become." My father wrote, "Time to start paying your way." Inside was a bill printed from a spreadsheet. It had columns labeled category, amount, note, food, 18 years, a number that made my eyes blur. Utilities, clothing, school fees, all the way down to toilet paper. Under note, my father had typed, "Rough estimate, subject to adjustment." I put the card back in the envelope and said thank you. I went to my room and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling until the moving grid turned into a map I could walk. That summer, I saved every dollar not claimed by rent and family overhead. I stopped buying anything that would show up later as a waste. I cut my hair myself with clippers borrowed from a friend. I sold the only video game console I'd bought with birthday money because the sound of my father saying discretionary in a tone that made it a sin was louder than the game. I stored my life in 2 plastic bins I kept under my bed like a go bag for a disaster you could schedule. The day I left wasn't cinematic. I didn't slam a door. I waited until my parents were at work. I ate the last of my oatmeal straight from the pot, washed it, dried it, put it back, because I wanted the ledger to have nothing to point to. I loaded the bins into the trunk of a borrowed car, put my backpack in the passenger seat, and took one look at the house. The roof was just shingles and nails, nothing mystical. I locked the door behind me. On the kitchen counter, the ledger sat open to a fresh page. The top line said, "Adult expenses me." I closed it. I didn't take it. I didn't need it anymore. I left at 18 with no plan other than not being there. That first night out of my parents' house wasn't glamorous. I crashed on a friend's couch, the springs creaking every time I turned. He lived with 3 other guys in a one-bedroom that smelled like ramen packets and mildew. It wasn't comfortable, but no one shoved receipts in my face when I opened the fridge. Freedom smelled like instant noodles and dirty socks, and it was still sweeter than home. I started community college in the fall, working nights at a warehouse. It was one of those jobs where the clock ran slow and your back hurt faster than your shift ended. I stacked boxes until my arms felt like lead and biked home because I couldn't afford gas. Rent went to the friend's mom, who let me stay in their basement once the couch filled up with another guy. The basement leaked in the corner when it rained, but the landlord didn't hand me an invoice for the buckets I used to catch water. That was progress. Every paycheck was survival math. Tuition, bus pass, groceries. I'd write numbers on the back of junk mail envelopes and circle what I could actually afford. The circle was always small, but it was mine. I made rules. No buying food that cost more than $2 per serving. No spending on anything I couldn't carry in a backpack. No debt unless it earned me more money later. It was brutal, but it was clean. Nobody else's voice weighed down the math. I kept thinking about that birthday card with the spreadsheet of my life costs. It had felt like a chain at the time, but as I sat in the library calculating how to stretch a single financial aid disbursement over 3 months, it turned into fuel. If my parents thought I was just a liability, fine. I'd become an asset so big they couldn't even imagine it. Community college was supposed to be a detour, but it became my proving ground. I loaded up on computer science classes because coding was the one thing that made sense to me. The same logic, the same cause and effect, but without the human pettiness of "oh" and "should." If the code worked, it worked. No guilt trips, no ledgers. I spent long nights in the computer lab, the hum of machines like white noise that drowned out the phantom sound of my dad's pen scratching in red ink. The warehouse job gave me blisters, but it also gave me access to old computers they were throwing away. I took one home, cleaned it, swapped parts, and made a Frankenstein machine that ran just enough to code on. That computer was my escape hatch. I built little programs nobody cared about. Budget trackers, inventory sorters, scripts that could take a messy list and make it neat. Boring, people said. Useful, I thought. I didn't need fireworks. I needed rent. Sophomore year, I got an internship with a logistics company because I'd shown one of my professors a script I wrote that shaved hours off his grading. The company paid me just enough to quit the warehouse. The office smelled like toner and burnt coffee, but I didn't come home covered in dust anymore. More importantly, it was a foot in the door of the kind of world where people paid for solutions, not just sweat. Of course, my parents didn't see it that way. I made the mistake of calling home once, mostly out of some leftover sense of obligation. My mom answered. "You got a good job yet?" she asked, skipping hello. "It's an internship," I said. "In software." "Oh," she said, drawing it out like I'd told her I was juggling for tips. "How much do they pay you?" "Enough," I said. She sighed. "Remember, college isn't free. We already put so much into you. You'll need to send something back once you're settled." There it was, the old debt collector tone. I hung up after a few more strained minutes, chest tight, promising myself I wouldn't call again soon. By the time I finished community college, I'd stacked enough scholarships and credits to transfer to a state university without drowning in loans. I moved into a cramped apartment with 2 roommates who didn't care if I skipped utility bills now and then, as long as I covered internet. They understood priorities. The building was loud. Thin walls, music at all hours, but it was mine. My name was on the lease. I stared at it sometimes, running my finger over the ink, whispering, "My roof." University was harder, but also clearer. I doubled down on programming, picked up side projects on freelance sites, and learned how to pitch my boring but necessary scripts to people who hated the grunt work of spreadsheets. It wasn't glamorous, but clients paid. I had to smile at the irony. My parents had treated me like an eternal bill, but here I was literally turning other people's bills into my income stream. Meanwhile, my parents kept trying to reel me back. Letters, mostly. Long ones from my mother about how family always comes first, and "you'll understand the sacrifices we made when you're older." Short, clipped ones from my dad. "Have you considered how you'll repay us?" A little each month shows good faith. I never replied. I kept them in a shoebox under my bed for a while, because some twisted part of me thought I might need proof one day. Then, during finals one semester, I fed them all into the dorm shredder, one after another, until the bin overflowed. The sound was better than music. Graduation came, and with it, a job offer from the same logistics company I'd interned at. Entry level, sure, but salary. Benefits. Health insurance that didn't come with a lecture. I moved to a better apartment, bought furniture that wasn't secondhand, and set up my own utilities account. Every bill that came with my name on it felt like a trophy. The first Christmas after graduation, I didn't go home. My mom called. "We'll see you for the holidays, right?" She asked, voice bright like it wasn't a demand. "I can't," I said. "Work." There was a pause, then my father's voice in the background. "Tell him he owes us at least one holiday." I hung up. I never picked up their December calls again. The years blurred after that. Promotions, raises, nights of takeout eaten at my desk while debugging code that didn't want to work. A side project turned into a product, and that product turned into the kernel of the company I run now. People ask me sometimes why I focus on efficiency tools, on invisible fixes. I don't tell them the truth, because I grew up under the tyranny of a ledger. Because the cruelest inefficiency is being made to account for existing. By 30, I had what I used to dream of while staring at that ceiling grid in my old room. Independence. A roof with my name on it. Enough money that no one could claim they'd subsidize my life. Enough, in fact, that I started to wonder, what did it cost them, really? Not the guilt-inflated numbers my dad loved to toss around, but the actual figure. The real price of 18 years. The thought dug into me. At first, it was just idle curiosity. But then it became something sharper. I wanted to know, not just so I could laugh at how wrong they'd been, but because if I could put a number on it, I could finish the equation. I could close the ledger on my own terms. That's when the idea started. Calculate the debt they always claimed I owed. Pay it. Exactly. Not a cent more. Then walk away. And once that seed was planted, it refused to leave. The idea started as a passing thought. What if I just paid them off, once and for all? At first I brushed it aside. Too dramatic, too petty, too much like something my father would concoct to prove a point. But the more I worked, the more the thought returned. In meetings, while debugging, during my morning runs. It was like a splinter I couldn't dig out. They had spent my entire childhood treating love like a tab. What if I settled it? What if I balanced their books so completely that there was nothing left for them to leverage? The first step was data. I didn't want guesses. I wanted a number that could withstand scrutiny. Their scrutiny, if they ever saw it. I dug through what I had. Old boxes of school records, pay stubs from my warehouse job, receipts I'd hoarded from those early years just to prove to myself I was surviving. At first, it felt like archaeology. Then it became obsession. Food, clothing, utilities, school supplies, medical care, line by line. I pulled from public data, government reports, cost of living calculators from the years I was growing up. The USDA had annual reports on the cost of raising a child. The Bureau of Labor Statistics had inflation tables. I cross-referenced everything. Sometimes I laughed at the absurdity. Like when I found the average monthly grocery cost for a child in the 90s and remembered my father's voice snarling about good yogurt. Sometimes I froze, staring at the numbers and remembering how much guilt they wrung from a $10 field trip. The total grew slowly, each entry a quiet exorcism. I didn't pad anything. If anything, I rounded in their favor. Clothes? I gave them the national average, even though I wore discount store jeans. Healthcare? I included insurance premiums, even though I knew their coverage came through my dad's employer. Rent? I calculated based on square footage divided by family members, even though they'd always claimed the roof as a singular, indivisible gift. The number, when I finally sat back and tallied it, landed just shy of $200,000. 18 years, food and shelter and school fees. A little more than the average cost of raising a kid in my generation, but adjusted with the sources I trusted, it felt right. Not inflated, not minimized. Real. I stared at it on the screen for a long time. My father used to say, "Numbers don't lie." I wanted this number to be a truth they couldn't twist. For weeks, I carried that figure in my head like a private key. It wasn't revenge yet. It was just knowledge. But knowledge has weight. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and think, if I wire that tomorrow, they'll have nothing left to say. Then I'd think, do I want that silence? Or do I want them to know why? I drafted letters. Angry ones. Cold ones. Lines like, here's your precious ROI. Or, investment returned. Stop sending collection notices in the form of guilt. But every draft felt like feeding the ledger again, like engaging on their terms. Words were noise. Money was the only language they respected. So I scrapped the letters and refined the plan. The transfer would be clean. Exact. A single note, debt repaid. Nothing else. The idea electrified me. It wasn't about generosity. It wasn't even about revenge in the traditional sense. It was about symmetry. They had turned my existence into a balance sheet. Fine. I'd close it. But it couldn't be rushed. I wanted airtight precision. So I spent months refining the calculation. Every spare evening, I'd comb through inflation charts, check exchange rates for the years they'd bought imported items, dig into archived costs of living in our specific region. I even tracked down the price of hospital delivery in my birth year through state health records. My father had bragged about having that receipt once. I wanted to make sure it was in there. Friends noticed me getting quieter during this time. You good? One asked over drinks. I shrugged. Just working on a side project. Not a lie, technically. At work, I was scaling the company, hiring staff, automating contracts, onboarding clients. Outwardly, everything looked like standard startup grind. Inside, it felt like every dollar I earned was one step closer to buying my freedom in full. Sometimes doubt crept in. Would paying them mean acknowledging they were right? Would it validate their years of treating me like a debtor? Then I'd remember the smirk on my father's face when he wrote child expenses at the top of that page. The way my mother asked if I thought about how I'd repay them while stroking my hair. They wanted repayment. Fine. But on my terms, not theirs. The moment I knew I was committed came one night when I opened an old box and found that 18th birthday bill they'd given me. Their rough estimate of my costs, typed in neat columns, smug and inflated. I compared it to my research. Their number was higher, padded with things like opportunity cost and lost leisure. I laughed. Actually laughed, alone in my apartment. They'd literally billed me for their evenings. That was when I realized paying them wasn't conceding. It was exposure. It was handing them a mirror so polished they couldn't avoid their reflection. I began moving money. Slowly, quietly. Setting aside in a separate account, earmarked final payment. I watched it grow until it matched the number. For the first time in my life, I felt the scale tip. Not because I was ahead, but because the ledger was about to close. I didn't tell anyone. Not coworkers, not friends, not the woman I was seeing casually at the time. It wasn't a story for sympathy. It wasn't even revenge in the kind you toast with beers. It was private justice. Meanwhile, the occasional letter still came. My mother, trying softer angles now. We miss you. It's been so long. Family shouldn't keep score. My father, blunt as ever. You should send money if you can. It shows respect. Each time, I'd slide them into a drawer without opening fully, sometimes not even breaking the seal. Their words had lost leverage. I had the number. By the end of that year, the account sat ready. Exact to the cent $197,652. 48. My father's pen would have itched to underline it in red. I waited another month, just to be sure. I reviewed the figures again, line by line. It wasn't compulsion. It was ritual. I wanted to feel every ounce of weight leaving. Then I opened my bank app, entered their account number, still etched in memory from when I was forced to transfer rent as a teenager, and typed the figure. I hovered for a long time over the note field. My hands shook, not from fear, but from clarity. Finally, I typed, debt repaid. No exclamation, no explanation. Just the words they'd taught me to live by, turned back into their mouths. I stared at the screen. The cursor blinked like a metronome. Then I hit send. The confirmation popped up. Funds transferred. The account balance dropped. I exhaled, long and slow, like I'd been holding that breath for 14 years. It was done, but the plan wasn't complete yet. Because the last step wasn't giving. It was leaving. The morning after the transfer, I woke up to silence. No phone buzzing, no email pings. Just the hum of my refrigerator and the faint city traffic outside my window. It felt surreal, almost anticlimactic. Years of build-up, one button press, and quiet. I'd half expected a call within minutes. My father barking into the phone, my mother trying to smooth his edges while asking for clarification. But nothing came. I made coffee, sat at my desk, and pulled up the transfer confirmation again. There it was, $197,652.48. Note attached, debt repaid. I closed the screen and, for the first time in decades, felt like my shoulders weren't carrying anyone else's ledger. The call started that afternoon. First my mom's number. I let it go to voicemail. Then my dad's, back to back, the ringtone vibrating across the table like an insect trying to crawl into my life again. I muted the phone. That night, my email lit up with their messages. From Mom, we got the transfer. That's a lot of money. Are you sure this is what you wanted? We don't understand. From Dad, this isn't how family works. Call us. I didn't reply. Over the next week, the messages escalated. My mother shifted between confusion and guilt. Money doesn't buy love. We just wanted respect. Can't you visit instead? My father's were sharper, angrier. You think this clears you? You can't put a price on 18 years. That was the point, of course. They had put a price on it, over and over, until I believed it myself. I'd just returned the favor. I sat with their words and felt nothing. No heat, no sting. Just confirmation that I'd done exactly what needed to be done. The second step of my plan rolled out quietly. One by one, I blocked their numbers. Then their emails. Then their social media. It wasn't rage-fueled, just procedural, like closing tabs in a browser you're done with. My father had once said, "A man settles his debts." I'd settled. Now I was done. For years, I'd fantasized about some big showdown, screaming matches, telling them everything they'd stolen from me, maybe even throwing the ledger in their faces. But the reality was cleaner. No theatrics, no wasted breath. Just a transfer, a note, and a lock on the door behind me. Still, the aftershocks came. I'd be working late, knee-deep in code, and hear phantom echoes. Don't forget who paid for those shoes. I'd walk past the grocery aisle with yogurt and remember the tap of my mother's hand. Sometimes, when I turned off the light before bed, I'd whisper to myself, that one's free. Small rebellions, still necessary even in freedom. A week turned into 2, then a month. The silence grew. No more new numbers trying to reach me. No more letters, at least not to my home address. I'd moved since they last had it. For the first time in my life, their voices weren't in the room, even in absence. The quiet wasn't empty. It was mine. I told no one at first. This wasn't a revenge story I wanted applause for. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't even dramatic outside of my head. It was an audit, completed and filed away. My closure. But eventually, one night over beers, a friend asked why I seemed lighter. You look like someone took bricks off your back, he said. I considered brushing it off. Instead, I told him a condensed version, how my parents had treated my existence like debt, how I'd paid them back and cut them off. He stared for a long time, then shook his head. That's insane. But also damn. That's tidy. He asked if I felt guilty. I realized I didn't. I felt liberated. The strangest part was how normal everything else remained. I still went to work, still paid bills, still coded scripts that made other people's lives easier. But underneath, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't working to outrun a ledger anymore. I was just living. Every milestone after that felt different. Signing a lease on a bigger apartment. Taking a vacation overseas, first time out of the country. Launching a new product line at the company and watching it land clients. None of it carried the undertone of, will this earn enough to silence them? That undertone had been exorcised. Sometimes I wondered what they did with the money. My father probably saw it as validation. My mother maybe as proof I still cared. Maybe they argued over it. Maybe it sat in an account like a shrine. It didn't matter. It wasn't mine anymore, and neither were they. There's a freedom in precision. I didn't ghost them because I was afraid. I didn't rage because I needed to vent. I settled the exact balance. No more, no less, then cut the line. Like reconciling a spreadsheet to zero. One evening, months later, I sat by the window of my apartment with a glass of whiskey and realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd heard my father's voice in my head. The red ink, the tapping pen, the lectures about investment, gone. The silence wasn't just external anymore. It had seeped inward. That was when I knew the plan had worked. Not because I'd punished them. Not because I'd won. But because I'd taken back the ledger they'd weaponized and closed it myself. The debt, real or imagined, was gone. The next chapter of my life could finally start with no columns, no receipts, no balances waiting to be settled. just clean pages. The months after the transfer felt like a new kind of apprenticeship, learning what life without debt, real or imagined, actually looked like. It's funny, because from the outside, nothing dramatic changed. I still woke up, brewed coffee, answered emails, dealt with the never-ending churn of client requests. But inside, the constant background noise I'd lived with for decades, the guilt, the ledger, the feeling of owing every breath, had gone quiet. Silence, it turns out, has a texture. At first, it felt fragile, like glass I might accidentally shatter by remembering too much. I'd be brushing my teeth and suddenly think, would Dad have logged this tube of toothpaste? For a heartbeat, I'd wait for the old reflex, the anger, the shame. But nothing came. Just the sound of running water, mine to pay for, mine to waste if I wanted. I let it run longer than I needed sometimes, just because I could. Work flourished in that quiet. For years, I'd thrown myself into building my business like a man trying to outrun wolves. After the transfer, it stopped being flight and became momentum. I wasn't working to prove my worth anymore. I was working because I liked seeing order emerge from chaos. I hired 2 new developers, then an admin. We landed contracts I would have been too anxious to pitch before. Clients started recommending us without me asking. Success, once a shield, was now simply a tool. I didn't tell anyone about the transfer beyond that one friend. Not out of shame, but because it wasn't a story that needed sharing. Revenge tales thrive on audience, but this wasn't revenge, not in the way people imagine. This was balance. I didn't need applause. I needed air. But absence draws attention. A cousin reached out on Facebook. Haven't seen you at family gatherings. Your folks say you're busy with work. True. I typed and deleted a dozen replies before settling on. Yeah, work's been full on. Hope you're well. Neutral, closed. I wasn't going to explain myself to anyone who hadn't been there with the ledger breathing down their neck. Every so often, I'd catch myself wondering how my parents framed it to the rest of the family. Did they brag about the transfer as proof of my gratitude? Or did they play the wounded victims, saying I'd cut them off without reason? I realized it didn't matter. Narratives were their weapon. Silence was mine. There were moments of unexpected grief, though. Not for them, but for the kid I'd been. I'd be at the grocery store, tossing things in my cart without checking unit price, and suddenly remember 12-year-old me putting back a jar of peanut butter because my dad had made a scene about luxury spreads. The memory would hit like a ghost hand on my shoulder. I'd buy the expensive jar now, not out of need, but ritual. I kept it in the cupboard, even when I didn't open it for weeks. A quiet monument to the boy who thought he wasn't allowed to want things. Dating was another strange frontier. I'd been careful for years, keeping people at arm's length because intimacy came with the risk of obligation. What do I owe you? Was the script I couldn't silence. But post-transfer, I started experimenting with letting people close. One woman noticed how I insisted on splitting every bill exactly. Down to the cent, you don't have to do math every time, she said, half laughing. I froze. For me, math was survival. For her, it was unnecessary. We didn't last, but the moment stuck. Maybe someday I could unlearn the instinct that every kindness came with a receipt. Meanwhile, the company kept growing. We moved into a small office, white walls, too much fluorescent light, but ours. I signed the lease and felt a surge of something teenage me wouldn't have believed possible. My name on a roof that didn't come with conditions. My own roof, my rules. The only time I heard about my parents directly was through a mutual acquaintance, a former neighbor who emailed out of the blue. Ran into your dad at the hardware store, he wrote. He says you're doing well, that you've finally settled your debt. Sounded proud. I read that line 3 times. Proud. The word felt foreign coming from them, even secondhand. And yet, the pride wasn't mine to carry anymore. If he wanted to spin the story as triumph, let him. I'd already won the only way that mattered, by walking away. There's an image that comes to me often now. It's of that old ledger, sitting open on the kitchen counter, my father's red pen hovering like a sword. In my mind, I close it again and again, each time gentler, until the sound isn't a slam but a sigh. The book is shut. The ink is dry. The debt is 0. Still, closure is never as neat as the fantasies promise. I'd expected euphoria, maybe fireworks. What I got was steadiness. A kind of calm I didn't recognize at first because my nervous system had been tuned for storm weather. Calm takes getting used to. Sometimes I test it. I'll deliberately do something my parents would have scolded me for. Leave every light on in the apartment. Buy the good yogurt and eat it standing at the fridge, lid discarded on the counter. Take a shower that steams the whole bathroom until the mirror drips. Each time, I wait for the phantom reprimand. Each time, silence answers. Freedom isn't dramatic. It's brushing your teeth without imagining the cost of water. It's buying dinner for a friend and not keeping track of who owes who. It's waking up and realizing you don't hear your father's pen anymore. And as the silence deepened, a thought began to grow. Maybe I'd tell the story one day. Not to them. They were ghosts to me now, but to someone who needed to hear that debts can be closed, that ledgers can be burned. Not as revenge porn, not as trauma confessional, but as proof. Sometimes the best way to win isn't to scream louder. It's to give people exactly what they asked for and then walk away forever. I had one last step before I could call it complete. I'd settled their account, but I hadn't settled mine. Not with them, but with myself. And that required reflection, the kind you can't buy, can't code, can't transfer with a note. That would be the final act. It's been almost 2 years since I hit send. Long enough that the transfer has faded from transaction to memory. Long enough that silence has settled into the walls of my life like paint. This is the part where people expect a grand finale, where I announce that cutting them off fixed everything, that I'm healed, that I never think of them again. But reality doesn't tie bows so neatly. What I found wasn't a fireworks ending. What I found was steadiness. When I look back, the overwhelming sensation isn't anger anymore. It's distance. My parents live in another country now, not geographically, but in my mind. They're like old neighbors I once had to share a fence with. I know they exist, but their voices don't carry into my yard. The biggest shift has been in how I define value. For most of my life, value was always tied to proof. Prove you're worth the food you eat. Prove you're worth the shoes on your feet. Even when I left home, I still heard that ghost voice. Earn it, justify it, pay it back. But somewhere along the way, after I paid them and cut the line, I realized value can just exist. You don't have to invoice kindness. You don't have to calculate worth in units of sacrifice. I test that lesson every day. When I grab coffee with an employee and pick up the tab, I don't keep a mental ledger. When a friend helps me move a couch, I don't feel the reflex to settle the debt immediately. It's not about owing. It's about connection. That shift still feels fragile sometimes, but it's growing roots. The company's thriving. We're not a giant corporation, but we're steady, profitable, respected. My younger self, bent over library computers and dollar store ramen, would hardly recognize this version of me. An office with my name on the lease, staff who look to me not as a bill, but as a leader. Every time I sign payroll checks, I smile. My parents used "we're not a charity" like a hammer. I get to pay people for their time and call it respect, not charity. That's how it should work. Sometimes I wonder if they ever understood what I did. If they sat down together and stared at the transfer, realizing that in one motion I had both given them everything they demanded and taken everything they used to control me. Maybe my father puffed up with pride. Maybe my mother cried. Maybe they argued. Maybe they convinced themselves it was love after all. I'll never know. And the strangest, strongest truth is, I don't need to. That's what freedom looks like to me now, not needing their side of the story. For years I thought closure would mean finally making them understand how much they hurt me. But understanding is a debt too, one they were never going to pay. Closure came from canceling the account entirely. The rituals I've built since then are small, almost silly. I keep a jar of good yogurt in my fridge at all times. I leave the lights on in the living room overnight sometimes, just to see the glow through the hallway and remember that no one's tallying the kilowatts. When I buy myself clothes, I don't memorize the price tag in shame. I cut it off and toss it. They're mine. That's enough. I've also started writing, not code, but words. Quiet essays, notes, sometimes just fragments of memory. I don't post them anywhere, not yet. They're just for me. It's strange to write without worrying how much ink costs, without hearing the red pen scratching across a ledger. Words without price. That feels like rebellion in its own right. And yet, there are moments when the old reflexes flare. When I receive a gift, my first instinct is still, how do I repay this? When someone compliments me, I almost deflect with, yeah, but it cost. The difference is now I catch myself. I pause. I remind myself, love isn't a transaction. It doesn't need a receipt. If there's any triumph in this story, it's not the transfer, not even the silence after. It's this, learning to live without a ledger, learning that I can exist without justification, that every meal, every light switch, every laugh doesn't need to be balanced against an imaginary debt. Sometimes people ask me about my parents, casually, like, "Are you close with your family?" I've learned to smile and say, "No, but I'm okay with that." I don't dive into explanations, don't hand over the heavy history. It's not a secret, it's just mine. My freedom isn't for their entertainment. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I think about that boy in the fogged-up bathroom mirror, 14 years old, shivering because the hot water cut off. He looked at himself like he was just a liability. I want to tell him, hold on. One day you'll stand under your own roof. One day you'll buy as much hot water as you want. One day you'll close the ledger and never open it again. That's the real ending. Not vengeance. Not validation. Just a man in his 30s, brushing his teeth in the quiet, drinking his coffee by the window, running a company he built with his own hands. A man who gave his parents exactly what they demanded and walked away. The ledger is closed. The debt is zero. The rest of my life is unpriced. And for the first time, that feels like wealth.